I'm a 21-year-old girl, and about a year ago, my parents kicked me out of the house. It happened just a few weeks after I turned 19, and it was right around the time of finals in high school. I didn't have anywhere to go, but luckily, my best friend and her parents let me stay with them. I'm really grateful to them. The reason my parents kicked me out was because my older sister got pregnant and they wanted her to move back in so they could take care of her. My sister isn't my full biological sister, she's my half-sister. My mom was dating Brandon, my stepdad, when they were in college. She got pregnant a few months before they graduated, but they broke up because it was just a casual relationship. Brandon still wanted to be a father, so they decided to co-parent my half-sister, Michelle. When Michelle was 4, my mom met my biological father. They dated for 3 years and got married. A year into their marriage, my mom got pregnant with me. My father didn't want to have a baby, but my mom did, so they ended up breaking up over it. After my dad left, my mom cut ties with him and his family and got back together with Brandon. So, when I was born, my dad was already out of the picture, and I was raised by my mom and Brandon. They got married a few years later. Even though Brandon was around, I never felt like he accepted me as part of the family. He was always distant and cold towards me, and Michelle treated me the same way. I got along okay with my mom, but it was always clear that Brandon only got back together with her because he still had feelings for her, not because he wanted me in his life. I was never able to like Brandon and Michelle, even though we've lived as a family for my whole life. It never made a difference to them. They always treated me like I didn't belong. My mom always said she loved me just as much as she loved them, but it never felt that way because she never acknowledged how distant they were from me. When I was younger, I tried to bond with them, but they always rejected me. Once I was old enough to understand what was happening, I gave up trying to have a relationship with Brandon and Michelle, and that's just how things have been. I shouldn't have been surprised when they decided to kick me out because Michelle was pregnant and wanted to move back in, but it still shocked me. I should have known that Brandon would always prioritize Michelle over me, no matter how much older she was. I guess I expected my mom to stand up for me, but she didn't. About a year ago, just 3 days before finals week, Michelle came over and told us she was pregnant. She was 25 at the time, 5 years older than me, but my parents decided to kick me out so they could make room for her and help her save money. Michelle and her boyfriend had been living together in a small apartment not far from our house. I thought it made sense for her to stay there, but she wanted to move back home because she didn't feel comfortable staying in that apartment by herself. She works from home, but her boyfriend has to go out for work every day, and sometimes he has to travel for his job. She thought it would be easier to move back in with our parents while she was pregnant, so she wouldn't have to be alone. Plus, they would save a lot of money on rent, since even her boyfriend was planning to move in with her. So they decided she would move back in, and then they told me I had to leave. I had to move out for a couple of months because they needed my room for Michelle. She already had a room in her house, but after she left for college, Brandon turned it into an office. My parents told me she couldn't stay in the living room, so the only option was for me to give up my room. They asked me to think of it as a sacrifice for the family. I might not have been so upset if they hadn't had this conversation with me right before my first exam. I was already stressed out because I had a lot of exams coming up in the next 3 weeks, but all they cared about was Michelle and her pregnancy. So I told them I wasn't going anywhere. I said that Michelle had never treated me like family, so I didn't see why I needed to make any sacrifices for her. My parents tried to talk me into it, but I thought they were being unfair, so I kept arguing with them. Finally, Brandon snapped and told me I had to leave by the end of the week, or he would kick me out. He said I was an adult, and it was his choice whether I could live in his house or not. I expected my mom to stand up for me, but she agreed with Brandon and said they needed space for their real grandkids. She said they didn't have the time or energy to argue with me, so I had to do what they said. When my mom used the phrase real grandkids, it just confirmed what I had known for years, that my mom, Michelle, and Brandon were their own little family, and I was always the outsider. I was so upset that I started packing my bags right away, even though I had an exam the next day. They didn't even try to stop me as I was leaving, so I knew where their priorities were. I ended up at my best friend's house, and when I explained everything to her and her parents, they told me I could stay with them as long as I needed. Some of you might wonder why I didn't go to any family members, but the truth is, I don't really have any family that I could turn to. I know Brandon's family is just like him, they don't like me at all. I knew it would be pointless to ask them for help because helping me would be the last thing they'd do. As for my mom's side of the family, I've never known them. Apparently, when my mom first got pregnant with Michelle, her parents and the rest of the family cut her off. They wanted her to focus on getting her degree and didn't want her to have the baby because she was too young. But she went ahead with the pregnancy, and since then, no one from her family has spoken to her. They didn't even come to her wedding with my dad, and they weren't there when Michelle, or I was born, at least that's what she told me. So, I didn't think I had any family who could help me, and I had to turn to my friends instead. After I got kicked out and started staying with my best friend and her family, I kept hoping my mom would reach out to me. I didn't expect anything from Brandon or Michelle because I knew they never cared about me. They were probably happy I was gone since I never fit into their perfect little family. But what really hurt was that even my mom didn't try to contact me after I left. After a couple of months, I gave up hope altogether. It's been a full year since then, and I've heard from some friends that Michelle had her baby a few months ago. She and her boyfriend have been posting about how proud they are to be parents to their daughter. The three of them are still living with my parents, probably to save money on rent. Honestly, I don't care about it anymore. I've just been focusing on improving my own life. After graduating high school, I had to figure out how to get to college because I didn't have any money now that I was cut off from my parents. My best friend's parents were kind enough to let me live with them rent-free, but I couldn't expect them to pay for my college too, especially since they have 3 kids of their own. I had been really worried about paying for college, but luckily, I had applied for a few scholarships. Since I'm a good student, I received a scholarship from one of the colleges I applied to. It wasn't my first or even second choice, but I couldn't afford to turn down any chance to save money. The scholarship covered 80% of my tuition, so I decided to take out a student loan with my best friend's parents as co-signers. I reassured them that they wouldn't have to worry about paying it back because I planned to work while studying and would try to pay it off myself. That's what I've been doing. It's been tough, but knowing I'm making it on my own feels rewarding. I hadn't had any contact with my family for the past year, and I wasn't expecting them to reach out. But about a week ago, my mom sent me an email saying she wanted me to come home for the weekend. She said she missed me, and so did Brandon and Michelle. They admitted they had treated me unfairly and wanted a chance to make things right. My mom was being unusually sweet in the email, and it felt fake. I had a gut feeling that something wasn't right, so I didn't respond. She sent another email a few days later, but I ignored that one too, even though I was curious to find out what was going on. I knew there had to be a reason for their sudden change, and it seemed unlikely that they were feeling guilty after a whole year. I know them well, and it just didn't add up. I got the explanation I needed 5 days ago when my maternal grandparents reached out to me. I was surprised they managed to contact me since I'm pretty sure my parents didn't give them my information. They told me they had to ask around a lot, and eventually one of my high school friends trusted them enough to give them my phone number. It turned out to be my best friend, and I'm glad she didn't tell me because it was a really pleasant surprise. When they called me, it was hard to believe it was really them because it had been so long. I had said before that I never knew my grandparents. I'd never seen them or heard their voices. At first, I was skeptical when they contacted me. But then they FaceTimed me and showed me old photo albums with pictures of my mom from her childhood and teenage years. That's when I finally believed they were really my grandparents. Seeing them got both them and me pretty emotional, though I wasn't sure why I felt that way. We started talking, and I told them about myself and my life. I tried to avoid talking about my parents, but it didn't matter because they already knew everything. They explained that the reason they hadn't contacted me sooner was because of my parents. They had recently found out the truth, which is why they decided to reach out to me. I was confused by what they meant because, as far as I knew, my grandparents had cut my mom out of their lives after she got pregnant with Michelle. That's what my mom had always told me, so it was all I knew. But apparently there was more to the story. It turns out that my grandparents didn't stop talking to my mom because they were against her having Michelle at a young age. Instead, they were against a relationship with Brandon. My mom had been telling me lies about her parents because she wanted to protect Brandon's image. My grandparents were actually supportive of her pregnancy and told her it was her choice whether to have the baby. However, they didn't approve of her relationship with Brandon because, at the time, he was a well-known addict. They had all grown up in the same neighborhood, went to the same high school, and even ended up at the same college, so my grandparents knew about Brandon's troubled past. They didn't want my mom to be influenced by him, so they gave her an ultimatum. They were willing to support her financially during and after the pregnancy, but only if she broke up with Brandon. After thinking it over, my mom decided to break up with Brandon because he couldn't clean up his act, no matter how hard he tried. I think my mom's decision was in her best interest, but it seems like she started resenting her parents. They got full custody of Michelle when she was born, and Brandon only had supervised visits for the first few years. Over time, Brandon finished his degree and got clean, but my grandparents still didn't fully trust him, and they were right because he kept relapsing every few months. He wasn't good for my mom or Michelle, so my grandparents introduced my mom to my father, who was the son of a family friend. After dating on and off for a couple of years, my mom married him because she had lost hope that Brandon would ever truly get better. But I don't think she ever really moved on from Brandon because, a year into her marriage, she went back to him and they started an affair. When my mom got pregnant for the third time, she had to come clean to my father about the affair because she couldn't imagine a life without Brandon. Knowing she was pregnant, she had to tell the truth. Her infidelity was the real reason she got divorced from my father and eventually married Brandon. So, everything she told me about my father not wanting me was a lie. After I was born, they did several paternity tests, and thankfully, I was my biological father's child. I had nothing to do with Brandon, which is a relief because I wouldn't want to be his daughter. My dad even had partial custody of me for a while, but I barely remember it since I was so young. Sadly, my biological father died in a car crash when I was 9 months old, which made it easier for my mom to lie to me for the rest of my life. My father's side of the family didn't want anything to do with me after he passed away, which worked out well for my mom. As for my grandparents, they were very upset when they found out my mom had been having an affair with Brandon. They gave her an ultimatum. Either she could cut Brandon out of her life for good and work on her marriage with my father, or she could get a divorce and never speak to them again. This time, my mom chose Brandon because he had been clean for almost a year, which was longer than any of his previous attempts. That was the last big fallout my mom had with her parents, and she was still pregnant with me when it happened. After that, they didn't speak to each other until recently. I was born when my grandparents softened up and decided to reach out to my mom so they could see me. But Brandon wasn't willing to play along and be a happy family with my grandparents because of how they had treated him before. So, my mom also rejected their attempts to reconcile. Despite this, my grandparents didn't give up and kept trying to talk to my mom every few months, but she never accepted them back into her life. This went on for a couple of years until Brandon and my mom hit a rough patch financially and couldn't afford rent. With no one else to turn to, my mom had to reach out to her parents, and my grandparents decided to buy her a house so she wouldn't have to worry about rent anymore. My grandparents hoped that this big gesture would bring them closer and maybe even make them a happy family, but that didn't happen. This was almost 5 years ago when my family and I moved into a new house. It was a huge upgrade from the apartment we used to live in, and I always wondered how my parents could afford such a nice place in a good neighborhood. My mom works as a receptionist and Brandon was in sales, but his company had been struggling, so it didn't seem likely that they could afford a house like that, which was out of their budget. Now I know that it was all thanks to my grandparents. Even though my grandparents paid for the house, my parents, being ungrateful, still didn't try to rebuild their relationship with them. My mom and Brandon knew my grandparents had bought the house, but my mom told them they weren't ready to reconnect and needed time and space to think about it because they hadn't spoken for so long. My grandparents, being kind and trusting, decided to give them a few months of space. When my mom didn't reach out to them after that, my grandparents tried to talk to her again, but she just told them she needed more space. This went on for the next few years, and eventually my grandparents accepted that maybe it just wasn't meant to be. They were getting older, and they told me it was humiliating for them to keep trying to contact their daughter, only to be rejected every time. So, they told my mom they understood she didn't want anything to do with them anymore, and that it was their fault for not being kind to her in the past. The only thing they asked was that she keep sending photos of our family so they could know we were doing well. That was all they needed to keep going. Surprisingly, my mom agreed to that, and that's how my grandparents had been dealing with the situation for the past few years. It was really sad, and I ended up crying when they told me all of this. I had always thought of them as villains, but that wasn't the case at all. Recently, my grandpa had a health scare with some heart issues. When that happened, he and my grandma decided they couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Since they weren't getting any younger, they felt it was necessary to try to fix things with their family. They wanted the peace of knowing they had done their best to reconcile before they passed away. So, a couple of weeks ago, they decided to drop by my mom's house, technically their house since they paid for it, and the deed is in their name. When they visited, my mom had no choice but to let them in. They found out that they were great-grandparents now since Michelle had her kids. But when they asked about me, my parents got really awkward and didn't know what to say. They told my grandparents that I was away at college and that it wasn't a good time to contact me because I was stressed with exams. They couldn't even come up with a fake college name, which made my grandparents suspicious. They had a gut feeling that something was wrong, so they decided to speak to our neighbors after leaving the house. That's how my grandparents found out that I hadn't been living with my parents for the past year after they kicked me out. My neighbors didn't know the exact reason, but their son went to school with me and told my grandparents that I had been staying with my best friend. So, my grandparents contacted my best friend and eventually learned what had happened to me. When they found out the truth, they were naturally furious. They told my mom that she and her family needed to leave the house because they wanted to make room for their only real grandkid, me. It was satisfying because those were the exact words my parents had used when they kicked me out. My best friend made sure my grandparents knew exactly how to hit where it hurt. Suddenly, it made sense why my parents were trying to reach out and make amends. They were about to lose their home. My grandparents had waited a couple of days to contact me after finding out everything because they were afraid of how I would react. But eventually, they decided to go for it since they had already wasted many years worrying about how my mom would react, and now they wanted to do the right thing. However, my grandparents wanted me to have the opportunity to decide what I wanted. They told me that if I wanted to give my family another chance, they would allow them to stay in the house. But if I wanted them out, they would make that happen too. When my grandparents visited, no one in the family seemed happy to see them, and I was the only one who genuinely showed interest in having a relationship with them. My grandparents didn't want to be fooled anymore, so they left the decision up to me. If I'm honest, I think I want them kicked out, but I'm unsure if that would be too vindictive. So, would I be the bad person if I told my grandparents to kick my family out?
Update.
Hi everyone, first and foremost, thank you so much for all the comments and support that has been pouring in since I made that post. It really means the world to me, and you can't imagine how much I appreciate it. After thinking it over, I've decided that I want my family out of that house. I shared my decision with my grandparents a couple of days ago, and now they're in the process of evicting my family. Of course, there's a lot of legal stuff involved, but my grandparents told me I don't need to worry about that. My parents, especially Michelle, have been trying to emotionally manipulate the situation, but my grandparents aren't falling for it. After talking to me, they learned exactly what my mom had been saying about them and what she taught their grandkids, so they don't have any sympathy left. Honestly, Michelle and her boyfriend both work, so they should be able to figure something out, just like many other people do. The same goes for my parents, so I don't feel bad about anything. After all, they didn't feel bad when they kicked me out, knowing I was only 19 and still in school. Despite everything, I managed to do well academically, even though it happened right before my exams. As for my college tuition, I told my grandparents they didn't have to worry about it, but they insisted on taking care of any student loans I had taken out. They also apologized for not being there for me earlier. We have a lot to talk about and make up for, but right now, things are going pretty well. Update 2. Hi, a couple of weeks ago, my grandparents started the process of evicting my family, and they have until the end of next month to leave. My mom isn't happy about it, and she felt it was her duty to let me know. She emailed me a couple of weeks ago, trying to get back on my good side and mend things with me, probably just so her parents wouldn't kick her out of the house. To be honest, the only family I have now are my grandparents, my best friend and her parents, and a few relatives that my grandparents are introducing me to. My mom had cut them off a long time ago because she didn't want anything to do with her family. It's all a bit strange right now, but I know I'll get used to it eventually. Update 3. Hi, the holidays have just started, and this time I've come back to my old house. It feels strange to be here since my family moved out a long time ago. I don't know what they've been up to, and I'm not interested in finding out. My grandparents have been staying here since they left, and they've fixed up the place nicely. Even my room feels like home again. We're hosting Thanksgiving dinner for a few family members and my best friend and her parents in a few days, and I feel like my life is getting back on track. I'm really happy and wish I could feel this way forever. Stay tuned for more stories about relationships. The recent email she sent me was very different from the earlier one. It's full of curse words directed at me. She even said she wished I had been in the car crash with my father so that both of us would have died together. So yeah, that's my mom for you. But it doesn't matter to me because she's not my family anymore. She's nobody to me.